Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Brittany Hobson. We begin tonight on the East Coast, where a 26-year-old First Nations woman was shot and killed by police in Edmundston, New Brunswick, early this morning. Edmundston police say they received a call around 2:30 a.m. to check on a woman. An officer says they were confronted by a woman holding a knife and making threats. The officer fired their gun and she died on scene. Chantal Moore was from Tileo-Quayat First Nation in Tofino, British Columbia, but had recently moved to New Brunswick to be closer to her family, including her 5-year-old daughter. Moore's family are calling for an inquiry. We're going to be following this developing story, and we're going to bring you more tomorrow. Shocking video of RCMP ramming a man with a cruiser reached Ottawa today as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked to comment on it. The video appears to show an intoxicated man in the N.W.T community of Kingnite and an RCMP responder knocking him down with his cruiser. Trudeau admitted there is systemic discrimination in Canada, but would not directly talk about the video.
We need to address challenges in our society that are a lived reality for racialized Canadians, for Indigenous Canadians. Even as we watch with horror what's going on in the United States, we know we have an awful lot of work to do right here in Canada. As a government, we have taken steps towards that, but as you point out, there's much more to do.
Missing children, institutional violence, and systemic discrimination, all urgently highlighted in the 170-page Quebec-specific MMIWG report released 1 year ago this week. But following the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police and the uprising that has followed, many are now focused on police violence. Lindsay Richardson explains.
They took to the streets of Montreal by the thousands to denounce racism and police brutality. Tear gassed and accosted by police hours into a peaceful gathering. In response to this global call for change, the Quebec Premier said this.
I think that there is some discrimination in Quebec, but there's no systemic discrimination. There's no system in Quebec of discrimination.
Pushback came quickly. Our politicians have a short memory, tweeted former MP Romeo Saganash. Just 6 months ago, Legault stood before Indigenous leaders to apologize for the Viens Commission's findings of systemic mistreatment towards First Nations and Inuit.
L'État québécois a manqué à son devoir envers vous. Il vous demande aujourd'hui pardon.
Before that came the Quebec-specific MMIWG report.
They made an apology, but we want action.
Nearly half of its recommendations involve policing, how Indigenous women are often treated with contempt or indifference. Questions about progress on both reports often strike a nerve.
What progress? Really? Okay. So, how many recommendations were made? Like 239 recommendations were made. Which ones were applied?
Nakasset of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal sees inequities daily. Indigenous women are 11 times more likely to be searched at random. They're ticketed in spades, many of them frightened of police. Sometimes waiting months to report loved ones missing. An Inuk woman from MMIWG once disappeared for 5 days in 2018, left in an industrial area at midnight by Montreal police, arm in a sling, only a bus ticket in hand. The problems are obvious, the solutions less so.
I think that if we wait for the SPVM to say, hey, we're going to start healing the relationship, we might wait forever.
The shelter is putting together a work plan to guide Montreal police in the process.
But we are sending out almost like an olive branch to say, let us help you with this.
A recent incident, now subject of a human rights complaint and an external investigation, involves 17 SWAT officers and a canine unit dispatched to deal with an Indigenous woman in distress. The president of Quebec Native Women is frustrated. Police reform was set as a priority when the inquiry began.
Ça me fait poser des questions. Est-ce qu'on s'investit encore quand on voit déjà des exemples de ce genre? Est-ce que ça vaut encore la peine? Et on ne doit pas quand même baisser les bras parce qu'on veut que nos femmes soient en sécurité. On veut que nos femmes aient les mêmes services qu'une Québécoise canadienne.
Much like the federal government struggles with the inquiry's findings of genocide, Quebec continues to struggle with allegations, even hard proof, of racial profiling. Premier François Legault has since backtracked on his initial comments, instead reaffirming his commitment to tackling issues of discrimination. And amidst calls countrywide to defund police forces until there's concrete change, the Mayor of Montreal says she's ready to reconsider body cams for the city's on-duty police officers. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
The Green Party of Canada is calling on the federal government to open a national inquiry into whether white supremacist and far-right groups have infiltrated Canadian law enforcement agencies. In a press release, Green Party leader Elizabeth May said, quote, "With Prime Minister Trudeau accepting the hard reality that racism persists in Canada, it is essential that we hold a full inquiry to determine to what extent white supremacist organizations are infiltrating our own law enforcement agencies and the Canadian Armed Forces." Thousands took to the streets of Calgary on Wednesday for the city's second Black Lives Matter rally. APTN's Tamara Pimentel was there and brings us this.
Black Lives Matter was chanted by throngs of people marching for change in the justice system in downtown Calgary. Streets were flooded and traffic came to a halt. Rayon Babakir says she is standing for all minorities.
All minorities need to matter before the rest of the world can fairly understand that all of us united will stand stronger against the oppressor. So if we don't all stand together and get justice for all the innocents, either by police or by their own governments, then there's no such thing as freedom or justice.
We can relate.
Kurt Young, who says he has faced racial profiling in the past, says Canadians need to realize that this isn't just a problem in the United States.
In so many different ways, in the injustice that we see, and the assimilation that we see with Black and First Nations people. And that's why I came here, because I can relate.
This is the second rally in Calgary. Another Black Lives Matter march will take place on June 6th. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
The death of George Floyd and police brutality have been the central focus of the protests in the U.S. and Canada. Today, Floyd's family, along with celebrities, musicians, and political leaders, gathered in Minneapolis for the first of 3 memorials. Darren Thompson is an Ojibwe journalist with Native News Online. He's been covering the protests, and he joined us earlier from the memorial. Okay, thank you for joining us today, Darren. And as I understand, you're at the memorial that's taking place. Can you just, I guess, give us a little bit of update? What's going on? What's the atmosphere like?
No problem. Bonjour, everybody. My name is Darren Thompson. I am currently a block away from the memorial for George Floyd. Right now, as I'm speaking, Reverend Al Sharpton is speaking, a very vocal and well-recognized member of the African American community in the country. The atmosphere is very uplifting, and the message is unification and solidarity.
So we've seen over the past more than a week now a lot of the protests that have been going on across the United States and some into Canada here. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what led to some of those protests becoming violent?
Sure. In regards to some of the protests becoming violent, I have some documentation where there were outside agitators. In my documentation, they predominantly have been white youth, particularly males, who are encouraging havoc and chaos and smashing up windows, storefronts along the marches, particularly on Wednesday, Thursday, and especially on last Friday, May 29th. So that is what I am seeing. And it's been several days since any damage or any destruction has been occurring. The protest against police brutality and, of course, the recorded murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department yesterday I marched with protesters in downtown Minneapolis, where the message and the goal was to call out false narratives in the media, particularly in regards to releasing and sharing press releases drafted and published by the government or law enforcement.
We've seen a number of Native American groups stand in solidarity with the Black community in the United States. But I mean, what is the impact of this on the Native American community?
Great question. There are many impacts. For the most part, like other communities, are immeasurable. So there are some negative consequences. Several buildings that serve American Indian communities here in the States were burned down due to growing fires, so it wasn't an intentional act. It was as a result of surrounding activity happening. So with that, of course, there's that devastation, there's that loss. In this particular situation, we are simply standing. As a result of that, and seeing some of our relatives in this, there is definitely unification and, of course, solidarity, not only in the Native community, but with other communities as well.
Well, thank you, Darren. That is all the time that we have for today, but I really do appreciate you sharing these perspectives with us, because we have a number of our own Indigenous communities here in Canada that are standing by the Black Lives Matter movement, so I do appreciate you giving us some of this context. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Inmates at an Ottawa jail launched a hunger strike on Wednesday to protest what they say are deplorable and unsafe conditions in the provincial facility. At 8 a.m. on Wednesday, a reported 14 inmates began refusing to eat over what they say are inhumane conditions. Among their demands for the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre, inmates say they are being served substandard food, and they want access to personal protective equipment to safeguard from COVID-19. APTN has learned from two sources that the hunger strike has ended and the inmates are satisfied with the response to their demands. Coming up, looking back at the decade-long legacy of one First Nations advocate. Here is Friday's weather forecast beginning on the East Coast. 20 in St. John's, 26 in Halifax, 13 and some rain in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, 13 above in Cartwright. In Quebec City, 28 degrees, 29 in Montreal, 29 and rain in London and Toronto, 16 above in Wawa, 27 in Thunder Bay in northern Manitoba, 13 in Norway House, 14 degrees in the Pas, sunny skies and 25 in Brandon, 18 above in Dauphin. In Saskatchewan, sunny skies, 20 in Yorkton, 24 in Regina, 15 above in Buffalo Narrows, La Ronge, and Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Shannon's dream was a comfy, her word, school for every child. But Shannon Koostachin would not live to see a new school in her home community. She died in a car accident 10 years ago at the age of 15. APTN's Todd Lamoran spoke with two people who say Shannon's words and deeds made them into allies.
Earlier this week, Charlie Angus compared Shannon Koostachin to civil rights leader Rosa Parks, especially on that day in 2008 when she called out Parliament for failing First Nations students.
And I think that was a transformative moment, very much like, Rosa refusing to get up off that bus. People remember the one moment when suddenly it all became clear, the manifest injustice that's been perpetrated against Indigenous kids, and Shannon became that voice, that face.
Cindy Blackstock first met Shannon shortly after that same event.
And I saw this group of teenagers leaning against one of the fences, and there was this young girl there with long, dark ponytails who just had a remarkable spirit, and that was Shannon Koostachin.
Shannon simply wanted a new school to replace the broken-down one she had to attend in Attawapiskat, and which threatened to destroy the goals of Cree children there.
She was really driven because she was afraid her childhood was disappearing. because of lack of opportunity. She was afraid that she would never get the opportunity to become something more.
It should be no surprise both Angus and Blackstock teamed up in August 2008 to nominate Shannon for a Children's Peace Prize.
As one of the greatest First Nations leaders that ever walked on this territory, I truly think that she was a remarkable young woman, and she was a spiritual young woman, a proud young woman.
Both Angus and Blackstock say Shannon would still be making a difference had she lived.
When I see young Indigenous activists, I think of Shannon, how much she would just really want to be there with them and to inspire them and to talk with them.
When I see the world really reaching out for a leader, someone who can provide that kind of center of justice, that center of hope, that center of possibility, and that center of action, she was all of those things.
Shannon Koostachin would have been 25 on July 12th. Todd Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
In the Northwest Territories, families of MMIWG have been waiting for action on their recommendations. But sadly, for some, all they've received so far is lip service. Our reporter Charlotte Mort-Jacobs has the story.
And this is all I have.
Every 30 days, Frida Cardinal receives the same letter from the Northwest Territories RCMP.
Allegation 1, neglect of duty. The police did not conduct a thorough investigation, including a thorough ground search, and failed to keep the family informed surrounding the disappearance of the victim, Stella Cardinal.
RCMP say they're investigating criticisms she made against them in her testimonial with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls hearings in Yellowknife.
Heard from the RCMP stating that they would keep me updated, and every letter they sent me was the same thing, saying the same thing over and over and over again.
Following the Northern hearings, $300,000 was allocated to create an RCMP historical case unit, a glimmer of hope for the 69 families who testified in the N.W.T. hearings. In the last 2 years, APTN News has repeatedly asked how this unit would be staffed, and most recently, how many cases are being looked into and what progress has been made. On June 2nd, we received this email declining an interview. It states they plan to release information on some specific files to engage the public and support their investigative work. Disappointment on the delay of the MMIWG report was brought up today in the N.W.T. Legislative Assembly.
Speaker, this delay in the development of the action plan concerns me deeply. We as Canadians, as a government, as an Indigenous woman, as a mother, as an aunt of Indigenous women and girls, cannot afford any more delays when it comes to the safety and protection of our women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA people.
Part of my job. Semler testified at the inquiry on behalf of her mother, who was murdered. Families also hope that funding for aftercare will be made a priority as they wait for a report.
We need more support, more than ever, for telling our story. For those of us who did, who need backup plan as well.
Even though the calls for justice have not been answered, it won't stop families from fighting.
It's tearing out your heart, and I will never give up. I love my sister Stella.
Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Hay River.
Winnipeg was one of many cities across the country yesterday that commemorated the one-year anniversary of the MMIWG final report being released. Survivors, families, and supporters gathered at the MMIWG monument at the Forks to focus on honoring those and their families that have been impacted. While there is no action plan yet from the federal government on the final report's 231 calls to justice, one organizer said the event was still an important step in making sure the voices of those impacted by violence remain heard.
As Canadians, we all have a responsibility to lobby institutions, governments, and even within ourselves to take different parts of the 231 calls for justice and see them implemented and lobby for them to be implemented, because ultimately if we're able to do that, we will stop the pandemic of violence towards Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited and gender diverse people.
This week marked the 5th anniversary of the release of the TRC's recommendations. After the break, we hear from one survivor on what that means. Here is the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 21 above in Grand Prairie, 20 and rain in Peace River. Sunny skies and 21 in Red Deer, 19 above in Calgary. Over to the west coast, 15 in Tofino, 17 in Quesnel, 17 above in Smithers, 14 in rain in Prince Rupert. In the Yukon, 18 above in Watson Lake, 15 degrees in Beaver Creek. Over to the N.W.T, 14 in Trout Lake, 15 in N.W.T, 10 above in Colville Lake, 1 degree in Sax Harbor. In Nunavut, 1 above in Arviat, Whale Cove, and Chesterfield. Five years ago this week, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its 94 calls to action. APTN's Priscilla Wolfe met with one survivor who attended residential school in the 1990s to get her thoughts about the TRC anniversary.
When we think of residential school survivors, the image is usually of our elders. But Serena Nicotine, a singer-songwriter, went to St. Michael's Residential School in the 1990s, before it was shut down. She says she went there by choice.
Oh, I wasn't forced into school, but I chose to leave home at a young age, at 13, because the effects of residential school was going on with my mom.
Nicotine is a third-generation survivor. Her grandmother and mother also attended residential school. And like them, when she left St. Michael's, she had a hard time.
Being a single mom, like when I left the residence, I came to the city, and it was homelessness and trying to go to school at the same time, doing the two things. It was really tough. And being a single mother, I fell into addiction. I fell into a domestic violent relationship.
Nicotine currently has a song on NBC's Indigenous Countdown. She said she attended the TRC gatherings in Saskatoon, but has mixed feelings. Nicotine isn't ready to start sharing the whole experience yet, but she's mentally preparing herself to start writing the songs and performing them about that time in her life.
I did go to listen to a lot of stories. It was pretty heartbreaking. I have my own stories as well, but they'll probably try to come out in song.
With the anniversary of the TRC, she sees it as a good thing that the public was made aware of that era and history of the Indigenous children in residential schools. Priscilla Wolfe, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
And that's all your APTN National News for this Thursday. You can find more Indigenous news online at aptnnews.ca. I'm Brittany Hobson. Have a great evening.